I really like how Obsidian has handled their class system in Avowed. There's three basic options to choose from, that being Fighter, Ranger, and the Wizard, so you get a full scope of options depending on what playstyle you prefer, but you're not locked into any one class, and in fact, you can choose active and passive skills from any tree that you want at any time. And the problem is that you do not get a lot of skill points in Avowed, so you can't be a jack of all trades necessarily, and to be effective, you do need to pick a primary focus in order to get the most out of your build, plus respeccing your skills can be costly, especially at endgame, which is why I wanted to create this guide to help you better understand each skill tree so you can focus on just the class skills that work best for you. But let's start with the Fighter class, which is Avowed's version of a melee tank or a warrior setup. Now, the Fighter tree contains passives which improve your damage with axes, maces, plus two-handed melee weapons, as well as your survival, such as increased maximum health. And fighters are going to start with a skill called Charge, which dashes forward and smashes anything in your path, interrupting enemies and stunning them, and can even deal explosive damage, which can break through walls. Now, the Charge skill is perfect for closing the gap to eliminate enemies quickly, which are typically further away from you, like archers, mages, or healers, which are very annoying in this game. And it's quite fun to use as it can throw smaller enemies literally across the battlefield. Now, fighters in Avowed can also specialize in the shield if they want to be a true tank. Passives like Shield Bash, for example, can slam your enemy while holding block to stun, plus push them back and interrupt, and the shields in this game are actually pretty effective in terms of reducing the damage you take from enemies with that block. You can also grab the Unbreakable passive here to further reduce the stamina cost of blocking. Of course, you can play a bit more active with skills in the fighter skill line, like Barbaric Shout, for example. This causes your weapon attacks to deal a higher amount of stun, which is actually really good. Believe me, you want to stun enemies while playing as a fighter or any class really in the game, as this opens them up to some amazing combo attacks that deal significantly more damage. You can specialize further in stun attacks, by the way, if you decide to equip a mace or a two-handed hammer, as a Stunning Blows passive increases stun buildup of power attacks with those specific weapon types by 25% all the way up to 50% at rank 3. Speaking of which, you can increase that melee damage even more with passive skills like Brawn, for example, which increases your two-handed melee damage by 25% up to 50%, again at max rank. But eventually you'll unlock even more offensive options for the fighter, like Power Jump, which is essentially a slam or a ground pound ability that does more AoE damage based on how high you fall onto the tops of enemies. So if you leap off a cliff to destroy your foes, that's going to do a lot more damage than just like a basic jump off a rock, for example. You can even potentially do an unarmed playthrough in Avow if you specialize as a fighter with the skill called Iron Fists, which ranks up your unarmed attacks all the way to legendary quality. So this is definitely something you may want to check out, though I wouldn't necessarily recommend unarmed at first, at least until you get more experience with the game. But overall, the fighter playstyle in Avowed is extremely hands-on, it's brutal, it's in your face, and it's very fun to play as this class, especially with how melee attacks work in this game, how you can build up stuns against bosses and elites, and execute those powerful combo attacks. Plus, there is a nice variety of weapons available in the game, as we've noted so far, so you could focus on two-handed hammers, for example, to build up stun, or use a two-handed greatsword to proc bleed damage, or you could shield rush and stun everything with your sword and shield, and then execute a jumping slam off the top rope for maximum damage and style. So all in all, this is a great way to build your character, so definitely check out the fighter class if this sounds good to you. Next up is the Ranger, which is focused on agility and finesse. Ranger has passives in their skill tree related to physical and ranged combat weapons such as pistols, muskets, bows, and then the one-handed melee weapons as well, like daggers, swords, and spears. Now, the Ranger is also going to have passive skills related to resource gathering, movement speed, stuns, and accuracy, and the Ranger has the ability to temporarily turn invisible to amp up that stealth playthrough even more. So while the class tree is called Ranger, I think it is more appropriate to think of this pathway as a blend of, that standard Ranger, which I think of as like bow and long-range weapons, with a bit of a rogue playstyle thrown in there, where you can, specialize in daggers, critical damage, movement speed, and stealth or invisibility. There's definitely like a hybrid blend here with the Ranger class tree. Now, Rangers who focus on, range are going to get a really great starting ability in Avowed called Tanglefoot. This skill literally brings roots up from the ground to trap your enemies in place. Now what's cool about this skill is also that it summons an AoE patch of roots, so depending on how strategic you are, you could place this in choke points and trap several enemies at once, or just aim it at the biggest enemy rushing up to kill you, and it's going to stop them dead in their tracks. It even works on bosses too, which is great, so it'll give you the time that you need to aim your ranged weapons and execute those big charged attacks, either using the bow or the arquebus, which is essentially a musket type of weapon, to unleash big damage and stuns. Now, speaking of which, if you are building a pure ranger, you should pick up the steady aim passive, which slows down time when charging those power attacks with bows or guns by 25% at first, all the way up to 75% at rank 3. Once you unlock this is pretty much easy mode as far as I'm concerned, as it does make any ranger setup using those long-range weapons extremely powerful, because as long as you have decent aim, it's really hard to miss something when it's moving at a snail's pace. Now you can follow that up with the marksmanship passive, which I would recommend for that ranged playstyle as well, because that is going to increase the damage of bows and guns from 25% all the way up to 50% at rank 3. Very, very nice for some extra passive damage. And there's also staggering shot, which helps you build up more stun against enemies while using those power attacks. Now, power attack from the arquebus, which is that two-handed musket I mentioned, is already pretty insane. So when you fully upgrade that, plus unlock this passive, you can imagine how you'll be putting down bosses and elites left and right in just a couple of shots. So this is definitely the way to go if that is your weapon of choice. But if you're interested in the more stealthy rogue variation of the ranger, that's where the skill Shadowing Beyond comes into play, which literally turns you invisible to let you reposition to get the drop on enemies or just avoid combat entirely if you'd prefer to do a stealth playthrough of a particular area. And don't forget that the ranger can specialize in the more stabby approach to combat as well, as you can increase melee damage with one-handed weapons like daggers, swords, and axes, and the finesse passive can also increase your power attack damage using piercing thrusts. Even more impressive, timing a perfect block against a target while specialized into the parry ability is going to knock an enemy back and give you an immediate counterattack. So that's another unique playstyle you can unlock as part of the ranger skill tree. But things get even crazier for high level rangers, as you can actually summon a bear pit to come fight for you in battle. With ranking up the skill, the bear can also taunt enemies for your team with its roar and increase its duration beyond its cooldown. So you can pretty much have this bear with you at all times, which is awesome. So if you're looking for a class in Avowed that's extremely versatile, that does amazing damage from both maximum range and close quarters, or if you want to specialize in stealth and invisibility, then you should definitely check out the Ranger class. Next up we have the Wizard, which is our final class option in Avowed that focuses almost entirely on spell casting. The Wizard skill tree empowers your two basic magic weapons in the game, that being wands and grimoires, which are essentially spell books. Grimoires let you cast up to 4 spells contained in the book without using a skill point to learn the spell, though if you have learned it already, the grimoire will make it even more powerful. The Wizard's first ability is called Minor Missiles, and this sends 3 projectiles that seek out the nearest enemy, dealing large amounts of damage. With further upgrades, you can double the amount of missiles sent out, so up to 6. This is going to be a great starting skill that will help supplement the damage of your wand early on. As I said, the heart of the Wizard class in Avowed is really focused on this grimoire mechanic, which gives you the option of casting most of your class spells, but for less cost and with a reduced cooldown. Think of this as a way to specialize your wizard even further depending on the grimoire that you have equipped. For example, there's basic elemental grimoires, which give you 1 spell of every elemental type, so fire, ice, shock, and then usually some sort of 4th support spell. Then there's the Ember Grimoire, which gives you access to better and better fire spells. There's also a Spellblade Grimoire, which gives you access to summoned weapons and many other options. Now, as I said, grimoires are not required because you can still put skill points into those same spells to unlock them that way, and you can even do both to make your spells more powerful, as we said. Choice is really up to you here, but the option to use grimoires is nice. For nothing less than it lets you try out a spell before you put some skill points into it. Now, in order to do this, you're going to need to put some skill points into an important passive for the wizard tree called Grimoire Mastery. This unlocks better and more high-level grimoires as you progress it, and it also reduces the cost of your grimoire spells even further. Now, outside of this, you can also focus on wand mastery, which increases the damage of your wands by 25% all the way up to 50%. And you can specialize your wand further as well with things like the blast passive, which causes power attacks with your wand to explode on impact, dealing stun and explosive damage. But as I said, the main variety of spells on the wizard are centered around those core elements of fire, ice, and shock. In the first few levels, you can unlock those abilities in their basic varieties, mostly, single target or short range. But then as you advance, you'll get more complicated and larger versions of those spells. So using fire as an example, level 1 you have Fan of Flames, which is a basic conal attack. Then at level 5 you can purchase Fireball, which now adds a long range component to the skill, letting you attack groups from a distance, which is good because it takes you out of that melee range. The progression leads all the way up to level 20, where eventually you unlock Meteor Shower, which is the ultimate in terms of fire damage and burning debuffs. Now keep in mind, as spells progress, they do get more costly, so that's something that upgrading your grimoire helps to manage, as it does have that reduced cost effect as well, so be sure to do that as you level up. Also keep in mind there are some defensive spells that the wizard can use too, which are very helpful. Arcane Veil, for example, creates a shield that reduces your damage taken by 50%, and if you rank it up further, you can even reflect back arrows and spells to the enemies that cast them, which is pretty great. But out of all three classes in Avowed, it's easy to see that playing the wizard is the most strategic and it requires the most amount of planning. This is different than the hack and slash fighter class or the pew pew of the ranger. With the wizard, not only do you need to do the most resource management because you're always casting spells, but you also need to think about which elements you're using and which specifically are best for that situation. That's because certain enemies are immune to specific elements, while other enemy types would be weak to that same element. So you need to factor that in, and then there are also combinations of elements where you can, for example, freeze an enemy with ice magic and then shatter them with an explosive blast from your wand. But if you're looking for a true tactician playthrough, a master of the elements that can wield amazing power in order to devastate your enemies with a flick of your wand or a snap of your spell book, then you'll definitely want to check out the wizard class. But one last thing you need to think about when it comes to picking your class and playstyle in Avowed is mixing and matching those abilities. Remember at the start where we said that Avowed doesn't lock you into any one skill tree, but instead lets you freely pick from all three. This way you can mix and match skills and spells however you see fit. And what I recommend here is that you think about your weapons first and determine which weapons you like to use the best, and then start to grab skills that support that playstyle. For example, if you like using a two-handed axe or hammer, but you find yourself getting frequently surrounded by enemies, you could supplement that playstyle by using a grimoire as your secondary weapon and include some barrier spells like Bristling Frost or Ring of Fire, which surround yourself in elemental magic to slow down the surrounding enemies with frost or dot them up with fire. Or if you like the wizard playstyle using a wand, but you find yourself getting rushed too often, you could pick up Tanglefoot from the Ranger skill line, throw this onto your skill bar, and now you have an extra ability to root enemies in place, and you have some extra crowd control. Now, personally, I have been loving the gun mage playstyle myself, which involves using the two-handed rifle for big single target damage against bosses and elites. That's my primary weapon, and then I use a secondary combo of a grimoire paired with a pistol. That's giving me quick headshots, plus some powerful AoE elemental damage and utility. There's really just a lot of options here, so don't be afraid to try things out and experiment. But hopefully that helps you understand the basics of class trees and skill options in Avowed. If this was at all helpful for you, do me a favor and crush that like button so YouTube knows to share this video with others, and check out the written guide linked down below for even more tips and tricks for classes in Avowed, and I'll see you around in the next video.